In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, Amen. Please be seated. All right, well, this morning we're going to talk about forgiveness. The story of the prodigal son sort of urges us to tackle this really important spiritual practice. So it reminds me of one of my favorite stories. Most of you have heard this before, but I can't help but tell it again. There's this woman that had a very, very nasty parrot. The parrot had a bad habit of practicing profanity. It loved to hurl insults at the woman at every opportunity. And whenever she'd try to hold the parrot, he'd always try to peck her on the hand or the arm. So one day, after months went by, he was going on saying insulting things to her, and she had just had it. Something snapped. And she grabbed the parrot by the nape of the neck, opened the freezer door, threw him in, and slammed the freezer door shut. Well, for a few more seconds, she could hear profanity come in, a muffled kind of profanity, coming from inside the freezer, and all sorts of outrageous insults. But eventually, things quieted down and got, let's say, deadly quiet. Well, then the woman became frightened. She said, "Oh my gosh, I've killed my pet." And so she opened the freezer door, and there stood the parrot just looking at her. The parrot very calmly walked out of the freezer, and he said, "Madam, I know that I have behaved very badly toward you. I have used profanity. I have said insulting things to you, and on many occasions I have pecked your hands and arm. I want you to know that I feel really bad about that. I earnestly apologize and ask your forgiveness. You will see no more of that kind of behavior from me." Well, the woman's obviously a little shocked, but she says, "Well, great, thank you. I accept your apology." And then the parrot turned and looked back at the freezer, and he says, "May I ask you a question?" And she said, "Well, sure." He says, "What did that chicken in there do wrong?" So, we've talked quite often about how difficult it is to follow the spiritual path of Jesus. Following Jesus into the path of forgiveness is a prime example of how difficult following his teachings can be in our lives. When was the last time someone hurt you? Bring up in your memory a time when someone insulted you or attacked you, accused you of something, in some way spread ugly rumors about you, mistreated you in some way. You remember what that felt like? What kind of emotions you experienced? What are you experiencing right now as you remember it, as you bring it back up into your thoughts? And how are you continuing to react even into the present moment? Forgiveness is a difficult thing. It's a demanding kind of spiritual practice. It is defined as the process of moving from one place, the place of holding on to anger, resentment, and fantasies of revenge, to moving to another place of letting go of that anger, letting go of that resentment, and foregoing any desire to do to this other person something similar to what they did to you. The story is told of a man by the name of Matt. Matt was a fireman, and he had pulled a double shift, and was very, very tired and very, very sleepy and should not have gotten behind the wheel of a car. But he did. And on his way home, he T-boned another car with a woman and her daughter in it. The woman's name was June Fitzgerald, and the daughter was her 19-month-old daughter. And in the accident, June was killed. The daughter was injured, but not killed. But the mother lost her life in the accident. On the day in which the sentence is being passed upon Matt for getting behind the wheel when he was half asleep, Sam Fitzgerald, the husband of June Fitzgerald, the woman who was killed, stood up and intervened on Matt's behalf. And Sam asked the judge to give Matt the lightest sentence possible. After that, Sam did a remarkable thing. He began to make contact with Matt and invite him out for coffee. And about once a month, these men would meet in some coffee shop and simply talk. And over a great deal of time, they became really good friends. Well, a reporter got wind of this and asked Sam, he said, "What? How could you do this? How could you reach out to and befriend the very same man who, even though it was accidental, the man who killed your wife and injured your 19-month-old child?" And Sam looked at the reporter and smiled and says, "Well, as I practice forgiveness, so will I be forgiven." Forgiveness is a tough nut to crack. It is, as I explained, a process of inside of ourselves moving from one place to another. It is never quick. It is never easy. It is not what one author called a pancake moment. You know, you reach into the skillet with your spatula and you just flip the pancake and voila, it's turned over. There's no switch to flip to make forgiveness happen. No, forgiveness takes place in that sort of complicated matrix that we call a human relationship. And human relationships are always complicated because we're complicated. We have our own histories, our own experiences, our own points of view, our own way of seeing the world, our own way of understanding reality and ourselves. That's complicated enough when you take one person into account, but when you take two and you mesh those together, it's always a little complex. There's always the unexpected. And forgiveness takes place in that sort of messy context of one human being with another. And because the context is a little complicated and a little messy, it requires patience. The process of forgiveness requires great patience. It requires a determination to get from point A to point B, a kind of dedication to see it through to the end. And perhaps most of all, I think, forgiveness requires compassion. Lots and lots and lots of compassion. Compassion not only for the person who hurt you, not only for the perpetrator, but also compassion for yourself, maybe especially for yourself. Because if you venture down this path, if you dedicate yourself to moving toward forgiveness, you're not going to make it without having a lot of compassion for yourself. Because it's not going to go easily or quickly or smoothly. There's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and it's never going to happen as fast as you'd like it to. And so if you can't have a measure of compassion for how hard this is, if you sort of beat yourself up because there are these pockets of resentment that just seem stubborn and don't want to go away. If you can't let yourself be an imperfect, fallible human being as you walk this path toward forgiveness, you're probably not going to make it. But if you're willing to walk the steps, if you're willing to do what is needed in order to get to a place of forgiveness, I think it's possible. And what I'm going to do today is talk about one of those steps, and then next Sunday we'll talk about another one or two to wrap up the season of Lent. But I always like to get the hard stuff out of the way. So we're going to begin by dealing with the hardest step of all. The first step, I think, is the hardest. It's why a lot of folks never sort of get out of the garage, if you will, on this whole forgiveness thing. The first step involves one of self-examination. It involves starting with examining what's happening in between your ears. Now, you can see immediately why that's not the default setting, right? This other person's hurt you. You're angry at them. You know, up until this moment, you've been contemplating some sort of strategically timed revenge. And so it doesn't feel natural to take your laser beam off of them and turn it on yourself. But that is the first step. The first step is to look at your own, what I call self-protective self-righteousness. Self-protective self-righteousness. I guess all self-righteousness is self-protective, isn't it, in nature? That's why we become self-righteous, is to protect ourselves from having to look at something we don't want to look at. And it's the same with forgiveness. As long as I can tell myself that I'm the righteous one in this situation, then I get to reinforce that with a whole lot of other self-statements. These are things that I say to myself within my own mind. What I get to do is I get to pretend, or at least ignore, or avoid the reality that at other times and places in my life, I have done something similar to other people. I have hurt other people the way that I have been hurt. As long as I stay in a place of self-righteousness, I can tell myself that I would never have done what that person did to me. I can tell myself that even if I had had similar experiences in life, similar backgrounds, even if I saw the world the same way this other person sees the world, I still, being the righteous person that I am, would not have hurt anyone. It's a kind of spiritual arrogance, if you will. A spiritual arrogance that prevents us from having to come into contact with those parts of ourselves that we're ashamed of, that we're not so happy about. Part of the practice of self-righteousness is what I call absolute dualism, or absolute dualistic thinking. Now, I know that you've never been guilty of this, but I have fallen into it on a number of occasions. And absolute dualistic thinking goes something like this: I'm completely innocent and he's completely guilty. I'm good, he's bad. I'm light, she's darkness. Or some variation on that theme. Now you can see right away that if those are the kinds of statements I'm practicing in my mind over and over again, I'm all good, they're all bad, I'm completely innocent, they're the ones that are the bad, guilty person. If I'm really rehearsing that over and over again in my mind, you can see how I'm going to stay stuck in my anger and resentment. I'm not going to be able to move out of there. Psychologists say we also play another mind game with ourselves, that gets in the way of us forgiving those who've hurt us, and that is what they call competitive victimhood. I really like that. Competitive victimhood. That means I'm a bigger victim than you are. My owie's bigger than yours. My pain is much worse than anything you've ever experienced. So therefore, I get to be morally superior to you. I get to place myself above you and ignore the fact that, well, I probably have mistreated people in a similar way. And I probably hurt other people just as much as I've been hurt. So it's obvious then that the spiritual path of Jesus of Nazareth, the path into forgiveness, is a path that has to begin. It just must absolutely begin with us rerouting our laser beam. And instead of being so clear and so focused on what this other person has done to us, the beam has to be channeled back into, okay, what have I done to others? Is it possible? Is it just possible that if I experienced something similar to what they experienced, that I would have reacted the same way or in a similar way? Another way to think about this is the spiritual path toward forgiveness involves the recognition of our common humanity between the victim and the perpetrator. That what we have working here are two human beings, two fallible human beings that probably respond similarly under similar circumstances. I'll close with this. We all remember Archbishop Desmond Tutu, right, from South Africa, one of the great leaders against the apartheid in South Africa. Well, one of the things that Bishop Tutu is best known for was that following the collapse of the all-white South African regime, there was a tremendous amount of woundedness among the people of South Africa. I mean, there had been decades of violence done from one person to another. Violence, not only physical, but psychological, financial, many violence in all of its forms. And so there was a deep and I think profoundly wise recognition that before the country could move on, it had to heal. That somehow or another, all of that injury, all of that woundedness, all of that rage and anger and resentment had to be confronted. It had to be dealt with head on. And so Bishop Tutu founded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that dedicated itself to having victims and perpetrators brought together to initiate the process of forgiveness. And the whole process was founded upon what in South Africa was known as Ubuntu, which is the South African word for common humanity, or the recognition that the person standing in front of me is also part of me. Let me read it to you. My humanity is, this is the meaning of the word Ubuntu. My humanity is caught up in yours. I am a human because I belong. I participate. I share. In essence, I am only because you are. Forgiveness seems to be related to a deep recognition of our interdependency and our common humanity. Next week, we will continue to look at the process of forgiveness, and we're going to especially take a hard look at the role of empathy in that process. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.